for someone to become an icon, you have to have a very particular combination of elements at a particular time.
There are many complex aspects of Che Guevara's work and his contribution and his character and his vision.
In Che's case, it was almost certainly the question of his youth, his death in action, his looks, and even the dishevelled looks.
People who met him, whether they liked what he did or not, said he's very magnetic. That sense we've got in the famous image of someone who's handsome, who has a charisma, has presence.
And the fact that he's associated somehow in people's minds with some romantic age and some heroic age, which is now gone.
People love tragic heroes who die young. It's a classic syndrome.
Well, I think it's become synonymous with revolution, hasn't it? Any time anybody wants to launch something that is revolutionary, they tend to gravitate towards that image.
I think it's that combination which makes him, at any time of protest, particularly appealing.
Che Guevara hailed from the city of Rosario in central Argentina. Its icon of today is Lionel Messi, but even the footballing superstar can't match the global reach of his predecessor, born in 1928.
Che Guevara is an Argentinian, which, given the fact he's so connected with Cuba, comes as something of a surprise. Middle-class Che is the kind of name for bloke or chap, so his name wasn't Che Guevara, he was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, to give him his full name.
He was white-lace Irish. He came from the right side of the tracks. His father was Guevara Lynch, of Irish extraction, and he played rugby. He was a very well-off kid.
He came from a fairly well-off middle-class background, and he had a typical upper-middle-class Argentine upbringing.
He was not politically active in Argentina, although his parents came from a politically active family.
His father was a supporter of the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War, and Che grew up with a sense of international solidarity.
You have to remember, at first, he wasn't a fighter. He was a doctor, he was a medic, who got on a motorbike with another man and went around Latin America in the famous Motorcycle Diaries.
Alberto Granado had known Che since the revolutionary was only 14 years old. When the two were both in their 20s, they decided to go on a tour of Latin America, a voyage that would change both of their lives dramatically.
Typical student, interested in having fun, drinking, having a good time, meeting girls, all the rest of it. And he was a med student as well, and he did a life-changing trip.
The key factor that sort of formed his political thinking was a trip that he made very famously on his motorcycle around South America.
He decided to go with a friend on an old Triumph Bonneville bike held together with wire on a tour around South America. But then something happened which changed his life.
He witnessed quite a lot of poverty and deprivation, particularly amongst working-class people in the mining districts of Chile, for example. And he formed a very strong opinion that the problem for Latin America was North American imperialism, US imperialism.
Well, in his tour, which is immortalised, if that's the right word, by the Motorcycle Diaries, he toured around and identified in a number of South American countries the injustices, these regimes, tyrannical regimes, often unelected regimes that were basically suppressing the poor and doing hideous things.
So this journey radicalized him, and he realized that his calling to try and sort of do something about the plight of the poor through medicine was kind of not going to work. He wasn't going to be able to be effective enough to actually transform the lives of people unless he did something about American imperialism.
Che Guevara's view of revolution was fundamentally internationalist. which makes him quite different because most of the revolutionaries of that time in Latin America were one way or another nationalist. They were either Argentine nationalist, Cuban nationalist, or whatever. He was quite clear that it was an internationalist, there should be an internationalist dimension to revolution.
He specifically got involved with Cuba was he bumped in Mexico to the Castro brothers, to Fidel and Raúl, and they were further on, in a sense, in fomenting revolution.
He met up with Cuban revolutionaries who were struggling against the Batista dictatorship in Cuba, which took power in 1952. And Che, after having a long conversation with Fidel Castro, the leader of that group, joined their movement. He initially joined the group as a medic and very quickly made the first comandante after Fidel Castro.
As Che Guevara found his calling in life, he also discovered his now legendary look of green military fatigues and a beret.
The way he was dressed was purely the way he dressed all the time. He did indeed. You look at any number of pictures of the time, he was going around in his beret and his guerrilla fatigues, as indeed they all were. He was the only one that had a beret, by and large. The others had their caps.
Che Guevara was rather a kind of designer revolutionary. He had a distinct look, which was informal and somewhat battley, fatiguey, but it was equally rather stylish.
Cuban strongman who appeared with his family at a press reception seemed untroubled by Castro's mounting offensive. Behind Batista stand the army, the police, and apparently Cuba's labor unions, who withheld support from Castro's general strike call.
Che Guevara would play a key role in the Cuban Revolution that ended the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista and brought Fidel Castro to power.
It's important to remember that the Cuban revolutionary movement was not a socialist or a communist movement. It was primarily a kind of liberal, democratic, nationalist movement. He became interested in politics as a result of that, and he was on the left of the Cuban revolutionary movement. It wasn't a left-wing movement, but he or one or two others were becoming more left-wing, more politicized.
The American reaction to the revolution initially was rather favourable. They thought this was a chance for democracy there. But as soon as it was clear it was a communist regime, they acted in a very repressive and unsympathetic way.
He went on to become a member of the Cuban government for 6 years, focusing mainly on promoting industry and also the transformation of the economy from a capitalist to a socialist economy. He represented Cuba as a diplomat, travelling around the world, speaking in the United Nations.
It was during his time as a member of the Cuban government that Che would meet the artist who would later create the poster that would immortalize him, Jim Fitzpatrick.
He walked into a bar in Kilkee in County Clare. Now, my mother's from County Clare, so I had a lot of relatives in that area, but one of the least expected people you'd ever see walking into a bar is a revolutionary like Che Guevara, who was really surprised that I recognized him.
The photograph of Che that Jim would eventually use in his poster had already been taken at this point by Alberto Corda at a public funeral in Cuba in 1960.
His two companions had sat down, so he was standing there talking to me. Very good looking. He didn't have the hair in the image, you see. He had a kind of big mane of it, you know. We started talking about Ireland, and he told me that he had Irish roots, and that's what's got us going. And I said, where from? Now, all the books will tell you he said Galway, but I think he also said Cork. I was also educated by Franciscans, so I knew all about Latin America, where they operated. So I found all that fascinating. You know? But it was quite humorous as well. It wasn't a serious conversation. And it was brief. I'm making it longer. Probably as long as I've taken to tell it, as long as it took.
Che Guevara's time in Cuba only lasted a few years. He became determined to ignite further revolutions around the world and made many enemies in the process.
He promised Fidel Castro that once the revolution was established and successful and safe, he would then move on to another revolutionary context somewhere else, and that's precisely what he did in 1965.
He then went to the Congo. He was very disillusioned at the level of Soviet support in the Congo. The Congo was a disaster as far as Che and the Cubans were concerned. They got chucked out. They lost that particular war.
Later, having returned to Cuba in secret, went to Bolivia to start a guerrilla campaign, and that was where his life ended after being tracked down and executed by the Bolivian army, which was being trained and supported by the United States and the CIA.
Rumor was that Cuban leader Che Guevara, here seen with Premier Fidel Castro, was leading the guerrillas.
The manner of his murder was brutal. A guy called Felix Rodriguez sent in a man called Mario Terán to kill him. And he was told not to shoot him in the head, right? So Che didn't die instantly. I think even the doctor eventually was forced to put a bullet into him. They shot him in the neck and he drowned in his own blood. He was a prisoner of war. As far as I'm concerned, we have the Geneva Convention, and the Americans and the Bolivians just simply disregard, just to get rid of him. And then they tried to disappear him. And that's when I thought, you know, in my arrogance, I suppose, when you're a young artist, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. You know?
The legacy of Che Guevara started to form as soon as the pictures that confirmed his death were released. But nobody could have predicted just how much of an icon he would eventually become. In 1960, Alberto Corder, a young Cuban photographer, captured the image of Che that would eventually be seen around the world. But it would only be after Che's death that most people got a chance to see it.
Photograph was a kind of accident, which is nice for the myth of iconic photographs, that you think of them as accidents.
It's a photograph that's rooted really closely in revolutionary history because it was taken at the funeral of a number of workers who were killed in an explosion.
The Cuban regime under Castro had been in power for a year or more, and they needed armaments because they thought the Americans were going to stage a counter-coup of some sort, and a ship of armaments had arrived in Havana Harbor, and while they were unloading it, there was a huge explosion, and there was a second explosion, and Castro's workers were killed and so on, and America was blamed, of course.
And so it became an anti-American protest movement, which crystallized the next day on the 5th when the funeral took place of those killed, and it was in Havana's main cemetery, Colón Cemetery.
Corder was amongst the press corps that was sent to cover it. The Cubans always build a platform for photographers so they could get a good shot of the leadership, you know. But he chose to stay in the crowd.
And then suddenly Che Guevara appears, not as one of the prominent people, but he suddenly comes into shot, as it were, and he takes an upright one and a landscape one, and that's it.
He sent the photograph, along with a lot of others that he'd taken that day, to the newspaper Revolución, but they didn't use it. And he was really quite bemused by this.
The photograph remained unused other than adorning the wall, one of the walls in Corder's house, between 1961 and 67.
It was an Italian publisher called Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli who first brought the photograph out of Cuba. Feltrinelli was a left-wing activist who wanted to bring worldwide attention to Guevara's dire situation in Bolivia. Alberto Corder provided him with his photo of Che, which was named the Guerrero Heroico, or Heroic Guerrilla Fighter. Corder had cropped the image to create the now legendary profile.
And then the next thing that happens is that Guevara dies, he's killed, and in revealing his death to the nation, Castro organized a meeting in Revolution Square where more than 1 million Cubans attended, and they used the photograph and draped it down the side of the Ministry of Interior building in Revolution Square, where if you go today, you'll see there is an iron version of the image permanently there.
After his death, Che's photo became widely dispersed at protests in Italy and at the infamous 1968 Paris riots.
The photograph made a huge difference when it came out, in 67, 68 particularly, because, for a start, although Guevara was actually just looking at the back of the crowd, the view upwards from the front of the crowd made it look as though, of course, he was looking into the future, looking at a great visionary.
So suddenly this image became really famous. Feltrinelli sold thousands and thousands of posters.
And by that stage, of course, he was dead. And therefore, the combination of that visionary look, the fairly dishevelled look at the time with the berry, it fitted perfectly and was being taken up by all sorts of rebel groups and rebel movements elsewhere in the world. It just struck a chord. It seemed to fit the image.
But it was the young Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick, who had met Che in his youth, that would provide the key step in cementing the image's legacy.
Jim Fitzpatrick was a young Irish artist who picked up on the photograph image and converted it into the poster. So, in a sense, the icon was created by Jim Fitzpatrick.
I was a fervent admirer of Che Guevara. I didn't realize myself at the time that I was creating such an icon. Now, I say such an icon. I realized I very deliberately created an icon. I wanted an iconic image that would be so easy for anybody to reproduce. It was deliberately simple. That is the absolute original. On top of it is this overlay, which is from the period. So the purpose of this, if you read all the instructions, which you don't have to, tells you where the white goes, where the red goes, and it's pretty simple. Red, black, white.
These simple, flat colours and turned into this iconic pattern. And that's important, because it's recognisable, even if it's debased, badly reproduced. You actually say, that's Che.
I wanted to hit the spot, I wanted to arouse people, I wanted people to look at it and admire him, and essentially never forget him.
So, in a sense, the icon was created by Jim Fitzpatrick because it enabled that photograph to become more than a photograph.
The image of Guevara may be popular around the world, but there are many who are dismayed with the idolization of Che.
The first time it was shown, I had it up in a shop in Dublin called Parsons Bookshop, one of the most famous bookshops in Dublin. A woman went in there, bought every one of the 25 and ripped them to shreds. Just ripped to shreds and walked away. And then another guy came along and threatened to put a brick in our window.
During his time as a key member of the Cuban Revolution, Che oversaw the execution of many individuals seen by the new government as traitors or war criminals from the Batista era. This period in Che's history has many conflicting accounts as to his attitude to the firing squads. Suffice to say, many Cuban exiles have the same feelings towards Che as they do towards Fidel Castro. His legacy will remain controversial to many. The image of Che is a worldwide phenomenon, seen everywhere from the poorest of shantytowns to the wealthiest of cities. But has the real story of Che Guevara become completely separated from the icon?
In Cuba, there's much greater awareness of the multi-dimensional character and contribution of Che Guevara. Outside of Cuba, he's very much seen as the idealist revolutionary.
I'd say it's probably the most widely reproduced image in the entire history of civilization. There's nowhere you can go that you don't see it. It's quite extraordinary.
I remember going to Glastonbury Festival and noticing how many people, young people, were wearing Che Guevara t-shirts.
I would suspect if Che Guevara looked at what had happened to his photograph now, he'd be pretty disappointed.
You only have to go down a market. You can see, like, tins for marijuana with Che Guevara's picture on them, cigarette lighters. Go on any website and you'll find T-shirts and posters and so on.
The image has, in a sense, detached itself from content, and this happens with other iconic images, something like Mona Lisa, for instance, the Leonardo picture. It's no longer a portrait of a bourgeois Florentine lady. And in a sense, the Che Guevara image has become an image in its own right, an icon. And it has associations with this youthful revolutionary, this idealism. It's a bit like James Dean.
But what would have become of Che Guevara if he had not died in Bolivia on the 9th of October, 1967? Would his exploits be seen very differently today?
I don't think the Cuban Revolution would necessarily have changed beyond what it was, because it was never down to one person or two or three people.
Suppose he'd actually managed to hang on and create something in Bolivia. Suppose there had been a revolution in Bolivia. Then the whole of world history might have been different.
Maybe he would have gone back to Cuba, and I think he would have become increasingly disillusioned by the course of politics.
On the whole, revolutionaries become establishment figures in due course. Maybe he would have become an establishment figure, but we can't tell.
Most Cubans know who he was, what he did. He was a revolutionary leader, he was an activist, he died in the service of the Cuban Revolution.
And I think that's more valuable and more interesting than what the image is associated with.
Nearly every Latin American government today is a democratically elected government. 20 years ago, no one would have even thought that that was possible. Morales in Bolivia has dedicated his whole campaign to Che Guevara. He used my image, actually, as an election poster. Every progressive regime in Latin America has quoted Che as their inspiration, so he's left a huge legacy behind.